Unsettled by Horror Writing is our topic for today. And we have two Connecticut authors who are writers of horror that are going to explore this topic with us. We have Jackson Kuhl, a writer and author specializing in American history, biography, and historical fiction. His novel, A Season of Whispers, is an amazing Gothic mystery set in a 19th century utopian commune. Kirkus Reviews called it a slim but delightful tale of terror set in transcendentalist New England. I think we know, right? It's a great book. His first book, Samuel Smedley, Connecticut Privateers, a biography of the American Revolution's most daring sea captain. It's a great book, incredible. And you will learn more about Connecticut from this book and roads you've traveled and landmarks in New England than you can imagine. You can see that our history is still right in front of us. You've published widely in a lot of journals and anthologies and ghostwritten memoirs. And when I read that in your bio, I thought that was hilarious that you've ghostwritten memoirs and we're here talking about horror. It's a great thing. John Opalenik has released 4 books, including the novellas The Primeval and The Primeval 2, The Blue Beneath the Mountain, and Among the Willows and Other Strange Tales, a collection of horror, Western short stories. Are you guys both members of the Horror Writers Association?
We are.
Yeah, and then there's a Connecticut chapter and a national organization, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess we could just plug that really quick. So the Horror Writers Association, it's national and I think beyond organization, and you don't have to be an author to join. There's different levels, and you also, even if you just join as a fan, you also get access to a lot of reads because authors will offer their work and say, would you like to read this? And if you like it, maybe put me up for a Bram Stoker. So it's just a great way to get your hands on a lot of good horror reads as well.
Right, and are there like regional events too that are available to members?
We have a monthly meeting. We'll also get together occasionally, and then we'll also do events. Last month we were at Connecticut Horror Fest at the Excel Center, selling books and talking with fans of the genre. We do library and bookstore things and branching out from there.
Yeah, be on the lookout. There's some great stuff. I'll be honest, I was never a fan until I read your works, and I gotta find it. Yeah. And speaking of libraries, I met both authors at the Norwalk Public Library's local author festival last fall. So libraries are a great place to meet people, right? And let's see. So from early childhood fairy tales to Scooby-Doo to Goosebumps to Stephen King, to you guys, horror stories are within reach at every age level. What is the appeal and what is the value of horror at every level of human experience? Why do we read this stuff?
Sure. Yeah.
This made me think. I was out one time not too long ago with some friends, and the girlfriend of the friend was saying that she loves true crime podcasts. And I said, my mom, everybody I know in my life, particularly my wife, loves true crime podcasts. And I'm like, what is it? Like, I'll come down in the morning, I'm groggy, I need my coffee, and my wife's like, let me tell you about this horrible story. I'm like, you just ease up until I have my coffee. And, I'm like, what is it? And she said to me, the friend said, it's because it's reassuring to me to know that I wouldn't make the same mistakes.
Oh, good.
And she actually found it very comforting. She was like, and it's the same thing, like horror movie, right? And you're always yelling at the screen in the horror movie, like, don't do that, don't go down the basement, why would you do that? And it's comforting to know that you wouldn't do that same mistake, that you think that if you were in that scenario, you would survive, because you'd be like, nah, that person's an idiot. So I think horror in a lot of ways is very comforting to people, because they can say, well, I wouldn't do that, I would do it differently.
Right, and I think it's also kind of baked into the natural human desire for storytelling. And we were just attending a talk yesterday, and they were talking about harbingers, whether that is, I think it's, there's that guy at the beginning of every slasher movie who's like, don't go to that campsite, you're all doomed. Or even in ye old fairy tales, the parent figure saying, like, don't go into that forest. it's, something interesting is going to happen there. Stories need stakes. In horror, stakes are naturally high, and it also, and it's funny that I reference slashers because horror can kind of put a mask on other things that we're looking at and make it more interesting to look at things. And I think it appeals to any age, like storytelling, and there's also that fun fall spooky aesthetic that we all enjoy on some level.
I suppose there's also an instructional value to fear. I teach high school freshmen, and we're talking about, do stories have value? What is the value of stories? And I started to talk about Hansel and Gretel and the cannibal. And a lot of kids didn't know the story.
Oh,
and you talk about like a pre-electric light world where the stakes in life are high if you wander too far afield.
Right.
I guess fear is fallen out of fashion in education. But at a time when there were lions and tigers and bears, were pretty useful to keep your kid alive, right? So there's that too.
But we have a desire for it, so we all seek it out. Whether it is I like horror, or whether it's that thrill and that risk.
There's definitely a thrill, right? I mean, why do people go to around amusement parks and ride roller coasters?
Yeah.
There's that thrill there, so people are, that thrill seeking.
But you're safe at the end of the day.
Right.
Like going on a roller coaster.
You're not really going to die.
Right. If I was doing that in just a car,
right,
it'd be pretty rough. But I know I'm going to be okay at the end of this.
So I was just thinking about with Scooby-Doo, the unmasking at the end and those meddlesome kids and stuff. Does horror, does it require the ends to be tied up in the end, to be comforting, or do you find that there are trends in horror writing where you're still left kind of spooked?
So there's this field of criticism that says that horror is ultimately conservative in that at the end the status quo is reset, right? That at the beginning the world is normal and then things go south and that you're just trying to get back to normal. Like you're not trying to get beyond normal, you're trying to get just back to normal. I think just about Scooby-Doo, we're just going to talk about that. I think it's like the greatest children's show ever made, because at the end it's saying no matter how weird something is, there is a rational explanation for it. And it is, that I just love that is a purely empirical sort of scientific explanation to the world that doesn't get caught up in superstition. So I love Scooby-Doo. I think it's great.
And I don't think all the loose ends need to be tied up. And Paul Tremblay is a great horror author, and I'd say he's the master of ambiguity. I know they just made a movie of, it was Cabin at the End of the World, and now I think the movie was Knock at a Cabin Door or something like that. And I haven't seen the film version yet, but I'm told there was a lot less ambiguity. And I don't want to give anything away, but the way that book ends, a lot of things happen, people make choices and do things, and they walk away like, was this something that we had to do, or is this just something we did? And telling a story that asks those questions, sometimes the mystery is also part of it, and I'm less of a fan of such and such movie explained, all those videos you see online where I don't think it needs to be. Or can we just suspend the disbelief and say, no, there's just that monster in the woods.
I think
don't worry about it.
Ultimately, it is a question of how comfortable are you with ambiguity. One of my favorite writers, probably my favorite, is Robert Aikman, who was an English writer whose stories very much are, I would compare him to David Lynch, to Twin Peaks. There really things are not wrapped up, and that there are a lot of ambiguous things, and it's almost, I always say it's like a connect the dots. And it's up to you to sort of connect the dots, and the picture that you draw might be different from the picture that the next reader draws. There's a bunch of events, and you've got to kind of connect them and try and you make the narrative. In that sense, it's almost like a choose your own adventure story, which I also love. You pick the narrative that what you want to believe. So I think it's more fun when it's ambiguous, when things aren't all wrapped up, and you have to come up with this story afterwards of like what happened, what was the story.
Is that perhaps the essence of horror, is that we can't know everything? Does that feed into the conversation in some way about life? Like, do we need to be rational all the time? Is there some...
Can we know everything we need to know?
Exactly, and how do we make peace with the fact that there are unknowable things in this universe?
Yeah, and that's something that David Lynch has talked about, that he absolutely refuses in interviews to discuss his work because he doesn't want to explain it, because you may read something that was written 100 years ago, that author's dead, you can't go interview that author and get that. So it's up to you to make that story. Just as we're looking at these guys, I'm looking at these landscapes here. It's up to you. It's a subjective experience when you're. What does this mean? What am I seeing here? What is the story behind this? So it's the same thing with literature. What is the story?
Right, and with our current climate of book bannings and book challenges, I think in my own mind, the best argument against not banning any books is every book captures an experience that allows us to walk in somebody else's shoes, imagine a scenario that might not be our own, right? And it just lets us live life a little bit in a different lane, perhaps, and deepen our understanding of others and our empathy, hopefully.
100%.
Can each of you just talk about how your topics found you without explaining your stories? I think the books are so rich and so unique. How did the story find you? What kind of muse is the creative muse of horror?
Sure. I mean, a lot more of my supernatural horror books that I write is based on actual things in my life than most people would think. So, I mean, we all mine our own experiences as writers to some extent. We, put different lenses on it and what have you. But one thing I like to do is explore a theme and think about experiences that kind of illustrate it. So, in my first two novellas, it's a duology. It's kind of about the theme of self-destruction, and then there's also, the story opens with the story of why my father does not enjoy hunting. And now everybody's curious. Essentially, when he was a teenager, he and his friends went into the woods and were going to go hunting, and they didn't know what they were doing, and they just kind of wounded some poor deer a bunch of times, and he found it so distasteful that it turned him off to it. And sort of taking that experience and just bringing it to another level from putting in the supernatural stuff, but also talking about different lanes and different life experiences. I like to read and write stories about kind of regular people. So whenever a synopsis of a book starts with like, head research scientists or FBI agents, so-and-so, I don't really want to hear much about like the most qualified person ever to deal with this. I like regular people dealing with stuff. That's why I think the movie Alien is a great example of, first it's a great example of sci-fi horror, but the crew of that ship, they're not top researchers exploring, they're essentially truckers. They're bringing a shipment of like minerals from some asteroid back to Earth to make stuff. They're truckers. And then they get thrown into the situation where they're in way over their heads. And it makes them more relatable. So it builds that empathy, because I know those people. They just happen to be in space.
So the hunting is a big piece of your first book, right? And you're not a hunter, and yet when you go through that, when you read the book, it takes us right into the woods and into that hunting experience. How can you just talk a little bit about your creative process? Like, what's that look like to write with such facility about something that's not firsthand experience?
Sure. I mean, I kind of start with thematically, what am I doing? There's a line in my second book that is, not everyone's cut out to be a killer, but everybody eats. And so I started with those sort of ideas, and then we go into the woods, and there are some hunting scenes, but a lot of it is also the elevator pitch is a construction company is trying to build a housing development in a very old New England forest. They stumble upon something ancient that they maybe shouldn't have, and it's sort of that carnivorous instinct personified is sort of what they stumble upon, and then we kind of explore, from an environmentalist standpoint, from a social standpoint, how self-destructive we as a society can be, because they're cutting down a forest, and then there's the whole you are eating another being, and then there's the whole monstrous supernatural bit to it, and it's just a way to explore those themes, and getting into the shoes of somebody who I'm not a hunter and what have you, is there is some level of research involved, but I don't feel the need to be a complete expert in things. And it's sort of that, because the characters aren't experts. So I researched enough. So there's a line in there where they wounded this poor deer a bunch of times, but they eventually got it. And it's like, well, you have to eat it. You killed it. And why does it taste so bitter? And it's like, oh, that's the lactic acid released in the muscle tissue and adrenaline, and so what you're tasting is fear. Now, I know at least some of that is true, but this character that said that, they're not an expert.
Right.
So I just need to know as much as the characters know, maybe just a little more to give it context.
Right, and this character that you're describing is an incredibly empathetic young man trying to make sense of his life, too, with a lot of pretty ordinary challenges with the family dynamics.
Oh,
On
certainly.
top of it. So can't say enough about this book.
Oh, thank you.
Jackson, can you talk a little bit about what that's like for you from a historical perspective as well?
Well, it's funny that you talk about getting the experience of being in somebody else's shoes. I'm a real believer that artists, but specifically writers, have one job, and that job is to go out and experience things in the world, and then come back and report on that. Now, how they do that is up to them. They can be a poet, it could be nonfiction, it could be fiction, it could be stand-up comedy, it could be whatever. But what you want to do is go out, experience things, and people may not like what you got to say. They may not like the experiences you had or the things, and that's where we're running into trouble, right? Where people don't like that they've come back and had these experiences. Now, I don't think that you have to take it to the sort of level that Ernest Hemingway did. I don't think you have to go out and be in 17 plane crashes or bullfighting, but I do think it's important that writers go out and experience things. And I talked about this on your podcast. When I sat down to write A Season of Whispers, I was thinking, in the sense, I was writing intentionally about, it became a sort of eco-horror where there's this something that's in the ground, and to me, I was thinking about Superstorm Sandy, which devastated Fairfield, where I am, and this idea that we think we're in control of nature up until the moment when we're not. And then what I realized afterward, that I grew up, a place where I grew up in New Jersey, my house was 400 yards away from a Superfund site. And I didn't realize that was actually what I was writing about, that this thing, there was a landfill where there had been some chemicals from Philadelphia and the surrounding area. They buried it, and the soil was very sandy. It leached into the soil, got into the groundwater, it was a mess. They cleaned it up in the 90s, but that's really what I was writing about, was this idea of like burying something, you think it's gone, and then walking away, and it's not. And so for just, take that, and then I had this other idea about transcendentalist utopias, and that's kind of like how I work, is I take two things and try and smash them up together to see what that synthesis is. But to your point, so right, there's the sense of history,
Right.
and then also this sense of lived experience, which I'm trying to communicate metaphorically, even to the point so metaphorically that even I wasn't 100% aware of it when I was writing it. So, yeah.
And then that is surrendering to the muse in a way,
Right.
right? Yeah, yeah. How did Sam Smedley find you? The privateer.
So that's nonfiction. So for about a period about 10 years, I was writing for some children's magazines about history and archaeology, and so I was almost monthly. And then I had for them, I was also doing a monthly blog about dinosaurs. Anyway, at one point, I was researching a story for them for an article I was writing, and I came across these references of Samuel Smedley. I'm in Fairfield, and that's where he was. During the American Revolution, Connecticut had its own state navy, and Samuel Smedley was captain of the flagship for the state navy, and had this absolutely incredible career. He was a captain at 23, had about 100 men serving under him, and what they were doing was that they decided that going up against the British Navy is not a great idea. So what they were doing was they were going out into the Atlantic and the Caribbean, and they were catching merchant vessels, capturing them, bringing the ships and their cargoes back to Connecticut, mostly New London, and then selling the cargoes and selling the ships, and that was helping to fund the war effort. Absolutely fascinating story, and I was like, why has nothing been written about this? There had been some stuff written in the 30s, but it was mainly for local historical societies so it really wasn't known to, I think, a popular audience, and so that's when I set out to write that book. I just became obsessed and fascinated with the story of his life.
And I'm sorry, you might have said, how did you discover Sam Smedley?
I actually found some references to him while researching an article for one of the children's magazines.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
And I was like, what is this? What are they talking about? And I just kept going, kept digging, and that's where it came from.
Yeah, and that is a book that's in our stacks here at Woodbury Public Library. Fascinating read. I know, Jackson, you'll be doing a horror writing workshop in Mystic?
That's right, at the Mystic Noank Library on October 30th. I think it's 6 p.m. It's a Monday. There's still space available. It's 90 minutes. Come in, and you should be able to leave with a finished piece of flash fiction. And we'll learn a little bit about the history of Gothic literature.
I'm sorry, could you say that date again?
It is Monday, October 30th at the Mystic and Noank Library. You do have to register, but it's free.
Could we get some insights from you guys on how do you go about teaching people to write horror?
John's a teacher, so.
Yeah, that's my day job.
Elementary school teacher, by the way, right?
Yes. So, and horror is very popular, and I want to write a scary story. So I sort of break it into, it's almost like a flow chart. I say, okay, you want to write horror. Okay. Do you want it to be realistic or not realistic? And then I'll say, okay, well, what is a real life thing that you think would be scary? Or sometimes just getting students, whether they are, because I've taught writing to as young as 8 and to people who are older than me. Sometimes it's just getting to ask those what if questions. So sometimes I'll say, okay, especially if this is a student I'm talking to, a child I'm talking to, I'll say, okay, you're home on your own. I don't know if that's something that you do, but you're at home alone, and okay, dark and stormy night, because of course. All right. You look out the window. What is the last thing you want to see? And then say, okay, go. So that's one way I'll do it. It's just the what if question. I mean, there's so many. I mean, you could boil down so many great horror novels, especially to a great what if question. And I get people to ask those. Of course, then we get into the nuts and bolts of story structure and all of that. But getting people to come up with ideas, it's sort of what scares you that you're also interested in exploring. Mm-hmm. Because of course, there's some things that might frighten us that we're just like, I don't want to touch that. That wouldn't be a fun or cathartic experience for me. But there's certain things where actually exploring that, especially through the lens of fiction with the remove of that, could be therapeutic in some ways as well.
Right.
So it's a bit of what I do with that.
For me, for teaching, I just try and pass on the sort of tricks. I wouldn't say systems, definitely tricks of what I learned. Like I've said before, which is just to have two ideas at least, and try and the more different they are, the better. And then just try and smash them together and see what you come up with. I really think that's worked for me. Yeah, I'm actually thinking for the workshop, I might even go around and might do something like where we just have like pick ideas out of a hat, like just like a bat or a witch or something like that, and just have words that you just like. Okay, you gotta have a bat or a witch in your story. I don't know how I'm gonna do it yet. So
I've seen a horror writing challenge thing where people were, I think, like tweeting in just words.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, incorporate this into it somehow.
You really do have to surrender to the creative music. There is a mysteriousness to writing. It's, it's presenting the questions and the materials, and then trusting yourself to get the words on the page. Could I just ask you guys, and John and I had a conversation a couple months ago now about what other authors besides those blockbuster names we see all the time would you recommend to readers of horror if they want to have a really awesome experience of good literature, but then they might not be the big name? Could you each just identify?
Sure. I mean, I think a great place to start is just, go to the HWA, Horror Writers Association Connecticut chapter, and just go down the list and just read everything they've all ever written. First, so we'll start with that. But I mean, there's so much variety in the genre, which we had a whole podcast episode about. But we're at a library event. I know John Langan is kind of known as one of the literary horror guys, which I don't like that term, and I believe he doesn't either because it's all literature. But he has a lot of nice literary allusions. There's a lot of Melville in his novel The Fisherman, which is also one of the most just haunting explorations of grief. So it's before you even get into any of the traditional horror supernatural stuff. It's a story of two men who are widowers, and fishing kind of saves them. They become fishing buddies. And then they hear an old fish tale from the turn of the century in the Hudson Valley that's goes off into a very cosmic horror direction. So, but he's also known for putting out a lot of collections of short stories. I actually just finished one last night. So I also think horror does very well in shorter form. I know for a long time in the publishing world they were saying, don't write novellas. No one will ever buy it. But they're becoming very popular in horror right now. I'd also recommend Haley Piper, Cassandra Caw. If you love a good ghost story, I just recommend it to Jackson. There's a book called Ghost Eaters by Clay McLeod Chapman, which is they figure out a way to see ghosts, and it takes place in Richmond, Virginia, which is a very historical city. And imagine if you could just see everybody who's ever died in Richmond, Virginia.
Oh my God.
So those are some of my, just off the top of my head, because we've all heard of Stephen King, and but these are some other authors that will give you a bit of variety.
I will again evangelize for Robert Aickman, Aickman. I highly recommend his short fiction. It's just amazing. Like you said, you have to kind of connect the dots. I love everything he's written. But to what your point, go to the HWA. They have a series of newsletters, but there's one called Quick Bites, which is available for anybody. You don't have to be a member. And every month they will tell you, like, these are the new releases, this is what our memberships are doing. I think right now it is just, there's an absolute abundance, a landslide of fiction out there, horror fiction, that we were just spoiled for choice. There's just so much coming out that you can't keep up. So that's how I would try and find out. Also, if you're looking for, and I know you've been a big promoter of indie writers,
Right.
and go to festivals like this, or and just shop around and patronize indie writers. And I always say, the great thing about events like this is that these are not books that you can get at the gift shop at the Dallas Fort Worth Airport. Like,
Yeah.
this is something that you're only gonna find here or in other like little festivals like this. So go ahead, pick up a couple books, you may find something that you like,
Yeah, there's great stuff, and the podcast that John's referring to is the Woodbury Writes podcast. If you check that out, there's some great conversations with both Jackson and John about horror literature.
Could I, just, you bringing up a podcast, and I know we could talk about horror recommendations we could be here all day, and we still wouldn't probably hit everything because there's such variety, so I just want to plug another podcast if you're just interested in finding more horror to read. There's a podcast called Books in the Freezer. It's called that because there was a joke that like, oh, this book is so scary that I don't even want it on my shelf, I'm going to lock it in the freezer. And each episode sort of has a different theme, so they'll be like, oh, here's great horror novellas. So I think that would be a great place to start. But also, I'm looking for some sci-fi horror, or they had like horror poetry, which a lot of people don't know as a thing outside of Poe. And so that podcast, you can just kind of go down the episode titles and like, oh, this feels like my brand of horror. And every episode I listen, my TBR list grows, and it's a good thing and a bad thing.
Thank you for that. Let's open it up. We have a question. Yes, we do.
I'm very greedy about this. I have 2 questions. So
Go ahead.
my first question is, I'd love to hear you talk about how you understand the Gothic or what that means in your own work. And then my second question is, do you ever frighten yourself as you're constructing your own stories, or when you get to critical moments in your work? So there you go. Choose from the following. Thank you.
I would say so for me, the Gothic is 2 things. It's the past coming back to haunt us in the present, and then also there's a sense of claustrophobia for being trapped. You're in a situation that you can't get out of. So like say Jamaica Inn, a great example of that. There's nothing supernatural in that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be supernatural. It doesn't have to be ghosts or anything like that. But the niece is caught up in something that started long before she got there, and she can't get out, right? So that to me is what exemplifies the Gothic genre, and it particularly, I think, what draws, because I write history, also, the past part draws me in. But that sense of claustrophobia of being trapped really sort of like, that's something that scares me. And, both in a sort of physical and maybe social sense, both in both senses of the word. So that's for me.
I mean, there is that classic definition where the past comes back. I don't think you could say something is Gothic without that being at least part of it, but I try to, in my own personal definition, sort of avoid that like very specific aesthetic of it has to be in this time period and this color palette and all of that, and just think, again, there's so many ways the past can come back to haunt us, and that's what we were just talking how like ghosts work so well for that, because you can't have a ghost that isn't the past coming back to haunt you. So that's one of my favorite ways to explore that. I think any ghost story would be at least Gothic in some sense of the word. So I just try to, when I think of it, I try not to pigeonhole myself into a very specific aesthetic.
Kind of like Silvia Moreno Garcia is doing a lot of Gothic,
Yes.
but it's like 20th century, building up that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
I don't think it has to be specific to a time period. It's
Yeah.
more of just a vibe,
Yeah.
right, and it's sort of like if you just feel it, also could be a thing. And I have short stories in 2 little literary magazines that have just come out. It's called On Magnolia, and their first issue's theme was New England Gothic, and that was essentially it. And there was a lot of stuff in there from your classic, period piece, exactly what you expect, but there were things in there that were, contemporary and were a lot of what people wouldn't think of. And then they went from, and then the latest release that is coming out on October 31st, right on Halloween, where the theme was ghost stories, so I think everything else will still kind of fit with that. So, and the other thing you were talking about was, have we ever scared ourselves?
Have you ever put your own manuscript in the freezer, as it were?
I don't, no, I can't because you're so close to it that it's just, because you're constantly writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. So it's kind of, it grows to the point where you even question, is this interesting to anybody except me?
Yeah.
So I think it's harder for the writer because it becomes kind of stale because you know what's going to happen. You know all the jump scares, right? So I think.
Yeah, I only had one experience like that, and it was, I had just bought my home. My now wife, then girlfriend, had not moved in yet, so I was in this house, on my own, and the way my desk was set up, my back was to the door, which what am I crazy? And I was writing on my own, and it was like, ugh. But I think that also had as much to do with the sort of set and setting of where and how I was doing it. Because if you're in a house that is definitely meant for a small family and you're there by yourself, all of a sudden it's like, there could be somebody in another part of this house and I wouldn't even know. And that was already in the back of my mind. So I think, I guess I really set myself up in that situation. Right? But on an average day where I'm just like, okay, let me see if I could bang out 500 words before the baby wakes up. It's a little more removed.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a couple of comments, and one of them is that I run some groups for writers in Fairfield County, and I can almost guarantee that if a writer is 30-ish or under, they're writing speculative fiction, including horror, sci-fi, fantasy, and all the rest. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about why young people are particularly drawn to writing about the other in this sort of a way.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that are into horror have felt othered in some way, and it sort of accepts that. It's so when we did the event, Connecticut Horror Fest, we were just surrounded by people who were into horror, and there's a lot of people who have felt othered, and that's how even if we go back to the classic Frankenstein, is you can empathize with Frankenstein's monster, and I think some people who have felt othered can really identify with that. And what young person hasn't felt alienated? Yeah.
I sort of wondered if they're scared of the future, because it's not a great outlook for them.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm very scared of the future.
Yeah, but I'm thinking of the ones that are reading about climate change every day and the horror and seeing it starting to really kill people, basically. Yeah, so that was one of my things. And did you see Neil Gaiman last night?
Yes, we did.
Wasn't he great?
Yes.
Yeah, I did too, sorry. And the young people in the audience were, a lot of them, sort of speculative, in their speculative disguises, and clothes and things. It's just an interesting phenomenon. I'm also finding that in over the past year or so, regular fiction, general fiction, including women's fiction, which is what I write, there's been an uprising in ghost and supernatural and afterlife kind of fiction. So stuff, books related by someone who's dead, who wants to take care of the people they've left behind. Or in my case, I didn't know I was writing to a trend because it wasn't a trend when I wrote it. The ghost of the widow is there to help her find a replacement for himself who's not one, just And so it's humorous. So I think there is space for books about people who are sort of haunted, but it's more like Casper the Friendly Ghost than frightened by it. And I think there's a trend in that, which is the kindly face of horror, if you like. And I'm wondering whether that was COVID that made people suddenly aware of.
I think as someone who straddles nonfiction and fiction, I think the thing with fiction, and Hunter S. Thompson was very much a believer that fiction was truer than nonfiction, because you could kind of say the things that you can't say in nonfiction, right? So when you're talking about, like young people getting involved in being more speculative, genre writing, I think in some ways you can say things and do things with the form that you can't say in nonfiction. And I'm wondering if maybe that's a sense, maybe that. I found that to be true with my stuff. So maybe that's what's going on there. As you say, people were talking about, there's the trend of ghosts in the afterlife. Well, what are they metaphorically saying?
Exactly.
They're saying something that maybe they can't say with nonfiction.
Right? Or it might feel miserable to say it.
Right.
Like
Well,
I was-
it wouldn't be credible in,
I was even thinking about a Christmas Carol.
right?
So I mean, if you took the supernatural out of that, and let's say Marley was still alive, and he's just maybe on his deathbed, he's like, you're a real piece of work. You should probably pay your employees better. That's not that wouldn't be as fun, and it probably wouldn't have had the legs that it had.
It doesn't have the resonance.
The fact that he's a ghost, and they're given these experiences, and it's that lens that we get to put over, thinking about a societal problem. There's a lot of horror out there that's exploring climate change instead of just thinking like, wow, that much of the world is going to be underwater in 50 years.
Right.
Right, so a lot of it is, how, and this is something that all writers struggle with, how do you put an emotion on paper? How do you put that down in black and white? Love, right? This is what artists have been doing for, thousands of years. How do you truly express this thing that cannot be expressed in words? And that's what, we're all trying it, we've all taken a stab at it, and it's, or fear, how do you express fear that, and put it into words, put it into characters, and actually put it on the page?
You're not expressing fear, what you're doing is creating it in the reader, which is much more valuable.
Or are you expressing your fear, and hey, aren't you scared of this too?
Yes, maybe too, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
So I find it it's very interesting the way people respond to horror. It's like they do or they don't want to be scared. The scariest book I ever read was Stephen King, Pet Sematary. And the end of that doesn't get resolved. It's what happens in the book is the way things go forward. And I'm thinking about our daughter hiding behind me while I'm sitting on the floor, peeking over my shoulder to watch Prisoner of Azkaban with the werewolves running around. Well, one is J.K. Rowling horror, and the second is there a fine line between thriller and is there a fine line between thriller and horror, or is there a line where they cross over?
So the question is horror a thriller, or what is the level? I mean, I'll say this: I don't like slasher stuff. I don't like slasher fiction. I don't like slasher movies. I'm more the ghosts and even like sort of like violence in movies. I'm very much like the 1940s. Somebody fires a gun and they grip their chest and fall over. Like that's the level of violence I'm comfortable with. So yeah, it's I guess just a matter of taste and what you're comfortable with. Luckily, the genre is so big that you can find what you're comfortable with in it.
And talking about, well, does this qualify as horror, does that, or where does it stop being a thriller and start being horror? I mean, a lot of those genre labels are just kind of marketing tools. I mean, the term horror didn't exist for a while. There was speculative fiction, weird fiction.
It's largely a recent kind of...
Yeah, it's not as old of a term as some might think. And it kind of blends with everything. So I did another panel at another event, and all we talked about was that why and how does horror blend so well with every other genre? So I think those lines are blurred at best, and possibly even, maybe those lines don't exist as much as we like to pretend they do.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you for coming up today.